So today I'm talking about vegetable gardening. I used to teach this class probably 20 times a year in Florida. I haven't taught it for a couple of years, so I might be a little rusty, but I'm sure we'll get through it together. The slide set was up last night. Hopefully you didn't look at all the slides and read them all, that you know all the information already, but how many of you did read your chapter out of the book? So this relates a lot to the chapter. I was really surprised, well, this is not really surprised, but my presentation from Florida is very, very similar to the chapters in your California book. So that's a good thing. So vegetable garden is the same across the board, whether you're in Florida, whether you're in Michigan, or if you're in California. The major difference that I found was with the soils, of course. The soils in Florida are very sandy. Here they can be sandy too, but some of you may have clay soils. So that's where some of the differences lie. Today I'm going to talk about a little bit about planning and designing your vegetable garden, how to prepare the soil, planting the garden, and also garden care. And if I start talking too fast, tell me to slow down, because I'll have a tendency of just speeding right up. So this is what we all strive for, right? Does anybody have a garden that looks like this already? If you do, please let us know your secret. So the information that we talk about today is going to be considered traditional vegetable gardening. Traditional gardening is in the ground, growing plants traditionally, how it's been done for many, many centuries. Non-traditional gardening techniques, which are used widely today, include using containers to grow vegetables. You could use grow boxes or raised beds. Hydroponics. I know a little bit about hydroponics to be dangerous. So I used to work at the Land Pavilion at Epcot at Walt Disney World. If you've ever been there before, they grow all these vegetable plants and herb plants hydroponically that are then used at the restaurants at Epcot. So I got to work there for about a year and really enjoyed that. So I know a little bit about hydroponics and also organic gardening. So your first thing to do when you decide that you want to grow a vegetable garden is to select your site. Site selection is very, very important. Of course, you want it near the house. I'm sure you've heard that phrase, out of sight, out of mind. So you want to make sure you have your vegetable garden in a location that you're going to be able to see it, visit it a few times a week, so you can see what's going on, because things can happen really quickly in a vegetable garden, because these plants have a short life. So if a water line breaks or a sprinkler gets clogged and they don't get watered for a couple of days, you can imagine what can happen. Or maybe an insect comes in, some aphids come in, and they destroy your plant within a few days too. So you want to make sure that you're able to visit your vegetable garden on a regular basis. And you also want it near a water source. Vegetable gardens do need a lot of water. And you don't want to be hauling out buckets of water every day to your garden. So you at least want it within reach of a garden hose. Vegetables need at least 8 hours of sun every day. Now there are some vegetables that can use less sun, but in general you're going to want 8 hours of sun every day. Level ground, I had to add this in for California, because Florida is level. So you want a level ground, or you might have to build up your rows. So you don't want your plants growing on the hill, so they can get adequate watering. And of course, away from competing tree roots. Tree roots can steal a lot of water and a lot of nutrients away from your young, tender vegetable plants. And of course, well-drained soils. So vegetables like to have their soil consistently wet, but not soggy wet. So we don't want really, really wet feet that the roots could rot. So we want it wet but well drained. So another little vegetable garden vegetable garden can be a family affair too. You want to get the kids involved, the grandkids involved, the nieces, the nephews. So when you're planting your garden, there's a few things you want to ask yourself. What vegetables do you like? How many of you like radishes? So maybe not even half of you. So if you don't like radishes, you're not going to put it into your garden, even though they only take 30 days from seed to harvest. So you get a very quick turnaround for your investment, but if you don't like radishes, you're not going to plant it. So plant vegetables that you like and plant them during the right season. And if you look in your book, and I have a picture of this later, but if you have your book, it's on page 344, there's a nice chart there. That chart is going to tell you when you can plant the different vegetables, depending on where you live. It tells you the months to plant them. This is very important because not all plants grow all year round. So there's two things I want you to take from this lecture today, and one of them, plant during the right season. And I have a great story about that. I did work with the correction facility in Florida, and I worked with the trustees. The trustees are the guys that are allowed to go out on the mow crews, and they're only in for minor offenses. We had a garden in the back of the jail, and the guys are really excited. All these guys have never looked at nature before, have never planted a garden. And they had all these turnip seeds. In Florida, turnips have a very short season to grow in the winter time. So usually maybe November through January. Well, this was probably in spring, or it's probably late spring. It's probably close to May. And they were so excited they went out and planted all the turnip seeds. Well, the turnips did grow. But when they were young little plants, they got attacked by millions of aphids. And if they were planted in the cooler months, when the aphids were less present, they probably wouldn't have been attacked because they would have been adapted to the cooler weather which they're used to growing in. They could fight them. They could also fight against the aphids. So it's really important not only for climate, of when the vegetables can grow the fastest, but also for pests to plant during the right season. What are you going to do with the surplus? Everybody hopes they have a surplus, right? But something to think about. One zucchini plant can give you more zucchinis than you ever know what to do with. I mean, there's only so much you can do with them. Do you have the right tools? Now, when we garden, especially if you're a first-time vegetable garden, get really excited. And you want to plant everything, and you want a huge garden. But just remember, the larger it is, the more work it's going to be. So the more tools you're going to need, the larger your vegetable garden is. The more labor you're going to need, the larger your vegetable garden is. The more money for startup costs. Isn't there a book or something called like the $60 tomato or something? You can spend a lot of money on a vegetable garden, so you want to make sure that you do it right. Because you don't want to be this neighbor that keeps pushing their vegetables on all their neighbors, and again, so much you can do with the zucchini. You can't do that much. I guess you could freeze it. So these are some of the cool season vegetables. Of course, they're not all listed, but cool season vegetables prefer to grow in temperatures between 55 and 75 degrees. So your asparagus, beets, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, carrots, cauliflower, celery, etc., are going to want to be grown in the cooler months. If it gets hotter than 75 degrees, they are going to struggle a little bit. It's a little too warm for them. Some of these vegetables will also bolt. And we'll talk about bolting later, but bolting is when they produce a flower head. So some of your spinaches and your lettuces and cabbage, when they bolt, the leaves, which is the edible part of the plant, turn very bitter. So they become inedible. A lot of these vegetables also, the cool season crops, can handle a little bit of frost. Not all of them. Some of them aren't as tender as some of our warm season vegetables. And some of the warm season vegetables include your beans, corn, cucumbers, all the cucurbits, not all the cucumbers, a lot of the cucumbers, eggplant, tomato, squash, etc. And warm season crops are going to be sensitive to frost. So if you plant warm season crops early and a frost comes, you will have to protect them. So 65 to 95 degrees typically. You might not want to be out there 95 degree weather caring for your plants, but that's another story. So the table 13.2, which is on page 344, this is going to be your vegetable gardening guide. This is going to be very helpful for you. Because I said the first thing I want you to learn today is plant during the right season. The second thing I really want you to learn today is plant at the right spacing. Space is very, very important for vegetables. Plants need space both above ground and underground to grow. If we plant the plants too close together, they're going to fight for space, for water, for nutrients. So you want to leave them enough room to grow. And another good story about that, I did a vegetable gardening class with some school resource people, and they had their own little raised vegetable beds, and I told them about spacing. They're like, okay, we're going to do this, try to do square foot gardening. I'm like, that's great, because that emphasizes spacing. But they went to before they tried it, I don't know if they designed it on paper. I told them to design it on paper first, but they went to the garden center, and they bought all these plants, and they only had little 4x8 beds. And they already spent my money on these, so they're stuffing these plants in. You know, a month later, these plants are huge. And there's not enough room for them to grow. And they're like, yeah, the one thing we learned is we should have listened to you about spacing. Your plants would have been a lot healthier, and they would have grown a lot better if you leave the spacing that they need. So it is important, you can draw it on paper first, so you know exactly how many plants you need, so you don't overspend all that, and then try to stuff them in all together. But I will give you tips on how to maximize space in your garden. But here's a copy of page 344. I really like this chart. It's very similar to a chart that we did have in Florida. What I really like is that it tells you how many plants to plant for a 4-person household. So you know how many vegetables that you're going to harvest. I think that's kind of neat, so you can plan that way too. It tells you the distance that you want to plant, both between the plants that are in the row. So if you have a row of plants, that's going to be between the plants in the row, and also between the rows. So you're giving space to the plants on all sides to grow. What it's missing, of course, I got to throw in our Florida chart. You might want to I can give you a link to download this one. The Florida one, like I said, is very similar. It tells you about the spacing for the plants. But what's not on the California one that I really like is days to harvest. I saw that on some California information. If you go to some of the Master Gardener links, they do have that. But I think that's important to know, because a lot of people will ask, well, how long does it take to harvest this plant? And also, we're going to talk about later the transplantability rating. So, the transplantability rating is important to know too. So here are some tips to maximize space in your garden. Because a lot of us are very limited on space, but we want to have a garden. So why not grow plants vertically instead of horizontally? Some of our vining plants, particularly cucumbers, can grow up. They don't have to grow out, because a cucumber on the ground is going to take up a lot of space. So here's just a trellis, and you can use anything you can imagine to build a trellis. Here they just have some 4x4 poles and some wiring and rope. And you're going to have to help the cucumber grow up a little bit. But it will grow up, you can help it grow up the trellis, saving a lot of space. It's also healthier for the plant to grow up rather than on the ground, because if you have an overwatering incident, you can have humidity buildup, which can lead to a lot of plant disease and also fruit disease. Some people will even grow it up and even put another trellis on the other side and put some rope in the middle to create like a roof too. So it's growing up, over, and then another plant's growing up the other side and over, creating like a, I don't know, what's that? A hut? Yeah, kind of like a, but remember, it's going to shade your garden. So you got to put this on the north side of your garden so it doesn't minimize the shading. And if you do have plants going around the top, it's going to shade everything below too. That's a great tip to maximize your space. And I've seen people do it with cantaloupe too, and pumpkins and stuff. But if you're growing some of those heavy fruits, like the pumpkins and the cantaloupe, you're going to have to give them extra support as the fruit grows. So people will take old nylons, pantyhose, and wrap it around the little watermelons or the little melons as they grow and tie it to the trellis to support that plant on the plant. This is just a close-up. Makes it very easy to harvest too. Down looking through all the plants. Another way to maximize space is to have wider rows. Now we talked about spacing is very important, but think of small plants like radishes. Radishes only need about 2 or 3 inches to grow apart. So you don't need to have one row of radishes have 12 inches to walk through and have another row of radishes, you can plant the rows a little closer as long as you have 3 inches on all sides of the radish. Does that make sense to everybody? So you're kind of cheating a little bit and making a little wider row instead of having a single plant row to save space. Yes?
The spacing requirements when you're growing vertically, the spacing requirements still apply? They're the spacing for the roots, not the plants?
Yeah, I would still leave the spacing as far as between plants in a row. So if it says 12 inches for cucumbers and you have a 4-foot trellis, I would put 4 plants there. So that's a good point. Yes?
When you're using drip in your garden, how are you watering multiple rows like that?
That would be a little bit challenging. You might be able to put 2 drip tapes down the middle of it.
I have 4.
Yep.
You have 4? I have 4.
4 drip tapes in her wide rows. Another way to maximize space is to plant short season and long season plants together. So we talked about radishes only having about 30 days from seed to harvest, where carrots have about 90 to 100 days. So you can plant them in that space between your carrots, put radish seeds. So by the time you're harvesting the radishes, when you pull them out, then you'll leave the ample room for the carrots to finish growing. So you're saving space that way. And this is a great idea for a container too, I think, to have the radishes and carrots together. Now some of the plants like corn, I'll talk a little bit more about corn, but corn takes a lot of space to grow. It takes about you need about 8 feet by 8 foot by 8 foot block of corn, because corn is pollinated by wind, so it needs to be close together. So if you want corn, it takes up so much room, you could plant a vegetable that can take a little bit more shade, such as like a leafy lettuce. That can take a little more shade and can grow between the corn plants to save space. You can also use your corn as bean poles. I don't have that slide in there, but I've seen where people plant the corn and then not on the inside of the corn because where the plants are, because it's too shaded, but on the outside rows, you could have beans growing up the corn as a bean pole.
That's a great idea.
So it's kind of neat. So corn should always be planted in blocks because they are pollinated by wind. You don't want to be out there having to shake all your corn stalks to pollinate them. And corn does require a lot of space, 1 plant per square foot, and it does take a lot of fertilizer. So there's a lot of input if you want to grow corn, just on a side note. So arranging your vegetable garden is basically up to you. You can arrange it any way that you want to arrange it. A lot of people will arrange it by planting dates or by harvest dates. So they're harvesting everything that comes to harvest within 60 to 90 days in one part of the garden, everything that comes to harvest, maybe 120 days, another part of the garden. Some will plant by plant size, having the taller to short, that helps with shading in the garden. And then you can also mix herbs and long season crops together, those permanent herb plants, put those in your gardens. There's always something green growing in the garden. It's really up to you. Any questions on planning your garden? Just like I said, spacing and timing of planting is very important, yes.
Is there any benefit to planting any plants that might repel insects or gophers? Or is there
companion planting?
Yeah, okay.
There's really not much research that has been conducted on companion planting, so we really can't speak about that. And there's a lot of beliefs out there that planting marigolds will chase out the nematodes, and the fact is, like with marigolds and nematodes just don't eat marigolds. They're not actually repelled by them. They just don't eat them. So there's some myths out there, and there's really not enough research to. But if you believe in that, and if you believe by planting by the moon, that's your prerogative. Go ahead and do that. Yes.
And do you recommend square foot garden? Do you highly advocate square foot gardening?
Square foot garden is great because square foot garden emphasizes spacing. Yeah. So does everybody know what square foot gardening is? No. Question? Yeah, or comment? Yeah.
I don't know about Florida, but if you plant a tomato plant every foot,
That's pretty doggone close.
It is close.
Yeah.
I like to say a tomato plant, if you're, especially container garden, like a 5-gallon bucket size is good for a tomato, which is a little more than a foot probably.
And I do
But-
square foot gardening, and I can say that they don't advocate 1 plant per square foot.
Right.
They'll say a zucchini requires 4 square feet, a tomato may require 2 to 4 square feet depending. Or
But
if it's-
they'll say you could put 12 radishes in 1
Right.
square foot. So it's kind of what it contains of, and there's a book out there. It's a patent and design. Mel Bartholomew wrote the book, and I think isn't he local? He lives somewhere here in Southern California. Maybe he lives in Orange County. But he does emphasize spacing, so it's not really 1 plant per square foot. It's how many you put your garden. You sanction your garden off into square feet, either by rope or some people will use boards, and then it will say, okay, I want to grow an eggplant. You know, it's like 1 eggplant per square foot. I want to grow carrots. Okay, you can put 12 carrots per square foot. It kind of goes off that. So you have this little square foot with 12 carrots in, you'll have 1 eggplant next to it, and so on. So it's really, it does emphasize spacing. Yes?
The Gardener's Supply website actually has a blank grid that you can drag and drop the plants in, so
Okay.
it'll show you how many you can plant.
And you can always cross-reference it with
Yeah.
the information in your master gardening book. Yes?
What is biodynamic farming?
I don't know. Biodynamic. It's probably using a lot of, I would guess it'd be a lot of organic practices to it. Anybody know?
That was in chapter 1, remember?
Is it? Yes, go ahead. It's not research-based, okay. That's why I don't know about it, no. Do they talk about it in chapter 1?
They mention it.
I'll have to look at that. All right, garden soil. Probably my least favorite topic, but you're all experts now in soil, right? So you had the class. So when you're preparing for your garden, of course you want to clear out all the debris. So take out the sod and the weeds and anything else that's growing there that's going to be in the way. Then you want to cultivate the soil. And I learned that you don't cultivate wet clay because you can compact it, right? And then you want to amend it with organic matter. After you amend it with organic matter, you can do a soil pH test. And we'll talk a little bit more about pH, but you guys already know everything there is about pH. So garden soil has physical, chemical, and biological properties. So the physical property is a sandstone or clay, which you guys all know what your soil is right now. Chemical properties, the pH of the soil, and biological is what are all the living things that are in it. Some things are good, some things are bad. There's a lot of living things in your soil. So let's talk about organic matter. There's a nice pile of organic matter. The benefits of organic matter is that it conditions the soil and improves the water and nutrient holding capabilities of the soil, especially if you have very sandy soils. Sandy soils don't hold water, they don't hold nutrients. You gotta add that organic matter to improve those capabilities. It also acts as a slow release fertilizer source. It's not going to give you enough fertilizer to feed your plant for the entire season. It just isn't. But it will give you a little bit of slow release fertilizer to it. And overall, it just increases the soil life. So you want to add organic matter to your soils, unless you have that perfectly loam soil that holds water and drains and holds nutrients. Is anybody lucky enough to have that perfectly loam soil? No? Everybody's either sandy or clay? So you have to amend it, right? So organic matter can consist of compost, which is going to be discussed this afternoon, manure, sawdust, leaves, grass clippings, peat moss. You can also put cover crops on your plants, or on your plants in your garden to use as organic matter. Animal manures. A lot of people talk about this. What kind of animals can you use? What kind of animal manure can you use in your garden? Herbivores, right? Horses, cows, chickens, rabbit,
Goats.
goats. Are goats herbivores?
Yeah.
If the circus is in town, elephants. I'm sure they will give you all the elephant stuff you want, right? Just go over to the circus and ask them. Yes.
Farmer Bill at City Farmers Nursery told me the smaller the animal, the more nitrogen in that product. Is that true? Like, is that more potassium over cow manure?
It could be. We'll talk about poultry is better than cow and horse. So I have those breakdowns on the next slide, which you want it well rotted. You don't want it fresh, so don't catch it off the cow and then go put it in your garden. Because if it's fresh, it has a lot of what in it? Nitrogen. So fresh nitrogen can burn your plants, high nitrogen, right? But what else is a lot in the manure? Salts. So if you're going to add manure to as your compost or as your organic matter, you want to make sure that you let it sit for a few weeks, maybe a month or so, in your garden to try to leach out some of those salts and let it rot and continue to decompose. We want it well composed. If you use mushroom compost, anybody use mushroom compost? What is it? It's not mushrooms. It's horse.
Manure.
It's horse. Yep. Yep. But it's well composted because they've composted it before they planted the mushrooms in it. And then they use it for like 3 growths of mushrooms and then they get rid of it. Yes.
Oh, a really good source is Mountain Meadows. It's free. It's up in Escondido.
We can't hear you.
It's a mushroom farm.
Right.
Mushroom farm in Escondido
They
called.
take the horse manure from the Delmar.
Okay. Oh, and they okay.
And then they do what they need.
They
with the
compost
mushrooms,
it.
And then they give it. It's free.
Oh,
wow.
Free's good.
What did she say? We can't.
What is it? What's the name of the place again?
Mountain Meadows.
Mountain Meadows in Escondido has free horse manure.
No, free mushroom compost.
No, well, mushroom compost is horse manure.
But it's already
composted.
already
super.
Already
You can
composted.
put
It's
it
not
right
fresh.
on your
It's not
vegetables.
fresh from the farm, right? And if you want to use, because poultry is a little higher in nutrients, so cow you'd use about, and horse you'd use about 1 pound per square foot to add in. Poultry about 1 pound for every 4 to 5 square feet. So there's a big difference there. Does anybody live near a chicken farm? You don't watch your chickens. Chickens are the worst. They stink. Oh, I don't know what happened here. My bull went off the line. This is not in, I added this slide late, so it's not uploaded yet. But just looking at it, you can see how weak these are. They're not full fertilizers. They're not going to give you all the nutrients that your plant needs for its entire life. But if you look at the hen and the turkey, so you can see it is higher in nutrients than the bull or the horse or the sheep. So, so if you can get poultry, and you can buy it, somebody had a great idea, then sell chicken and cow manure to you for like $5 a bag. I wish I thought of that. Making lots of money on it. So, but that's why you would use less turkey and chicken manure. So you guys know about soil pH is the acidity or alkalinity of the soil. The best range for vegetables is about 5.8 to 6.5, and you can do a soil test to find out your exact soil pH. If it's too acid, you have to lime it with dolomite. And if a homeowner calls and asks you, make sure you say dolomite lime. I just say you have to lime it, and they're like, well, how many limes do I have to lime? They're thinking limes, like citrus. So if it's too alkaline, you can add micronutrients like sulfur and gypsum, and that will decrease the soil pH, but usually that's only temporary for 1 season. So I recommend getting a soil test every season if you have too high of soil pH to make sure you're at the right levels. So here's a gentleman has this pile. It's rototilling it in. You can rent these rototillers from the tool rental places. Whoops, where'd it go? If you ever used one of these, Has anybody ever used one before? They're hard, right? You can't, because it will just run along the top. You gotta hold it back and use your muscles so it digs down deep. And you wanna get it like 6 to 8 inches deep to get that good mixture in there. And you do soil tests, and this guy, his came back 2 acids, that's dolomite lime that he's adding onto his garden. Any questions about soil? Okay, we'll go on to fertilizer. When you're fertilizing your garden, do you guys have much about fertilizers yet?
No.
No?
No.
Hey, Jen, I'm sorry, can I just ask one question?
Sure.
About soil? Crop rotation.
The question was
talk about that?
crop rotation.
Yeah.
We'll talk a little bit about that in the disease section.
All right,
So remind me though.
Okay, thanks.
So fertilizers, or nutrients. The primary nutrients that the plants need, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. These are those 3 numbers you see on the fertilizer bag. NPK, the first, second, and third. The first number of the fertilizer bag represents nitrogen. The second number represents phosphorus, and the third number represents potassium. If there's a 4th number on the bag, that's magnesium. So macronutrients and then secondary macronutrients are calcium, magnesium, sulfur. Macro doesn't mean that these are any more important than the micronutrients. It just means that these are used in greater quantity by the plants. Micronutrients are just as important as the macronutrients, but aren't used as much. But they include boron, chlorine, copper, iron, manganese, molybdenum, and zinc. So those are going to be your micronutrients. Some plants require more micronutrients than others. What micronutrient does tomatoes really like? Well, it's not a micronutrient. Never mind. They like calcium. But we'll talk more about plant deficiencies when we talk about the problem section. But these are all, when you look at your fertilizer bag, you'll see the first 3 numbers. But then if you read the back of the label, you might see that it also contains iron and sulfur and some of the other micronutrients. If you have a complete fertilizer is going to have a number in all 3 of those places. So it might be like a 10-10-10 or 12-12-12 or a 8-4-8. If it says 10-0-10, that's not complete. That would be an incomplete fertilizer because there's one of the micronutrients, there's 3 micronutrients that's missing. For example, potash is incomplete because it's just potassium. It doesn't have the nitrogen and the phosphorus in it. For most vegetable gardens, vegetables are short-lived plants. Most of them are annuals. Of course, there are some biennials and there are some perennials, but most of your vegetables are grown as annuals. They're short-lived plants. They might live anywhere from 3 to 6 months. Because they're short-lived plants, you got to give them the nutrients they need. Somebody is very mad outside. So a balanced fertilizer is what's typically used in a vegetable garden. But sometimes you might see some that aren't quite balanced, but still have a vegetable garden label on it, and that's fine. But often you're going to have a 1-to-1-to-1 ratio, 8-8-8, 10-10-10, 12-12-12. The higher the numbers, the stronger the fertilizer. So you might be paying more for a 12-12-12 versus a 5-5-5 or a 8-8-8, but you're going to be using less of it because it's a stronger fertilizer. The tag shows you what's in the bag. So if you look at this 8-8-8, 8% of the bag or the container is nitrogen, 8% of the container is phosphorus, and 8% is potassium. So 8 times 3 is 24. And that was a question mark on the end, right? 24. So that's 76% is what else? Filler, inert materials. Some of it might be micronutrients, right? But a lot of it is materials that help you use the product better. It might be colorings. It might be things that help the product dissolve in water. So there's a lot of other inert ingredients that are also in that bag. Usually for vegetable gardens, a lot of times you're going to use water-soluble fertilizers. That means they're immediately available to the plants, and they usually last about 2 to 3 weeks. Sometimes you can use the slow release fertilizers. So you might use the Osmocote or the Dynamite or some of the other slow release fertilizers out there. And those you would apply less often. What it says like 4 to 6 months. And those are usually released to the plants with heat and water. So the hotter it is, the warmer it is, the wetter it is, the faster they're going to release to the plants. This is out of your book. If you're using organic material, you want to make sure that you're going to need to add more nitrogen. The reason is a lot of compost has those microbials in it and other beneficial bacteria that like to eat up your nitrogen and steal them away from your plant. So you might need to add more nitrogen when you're using organic material. Sources of nitrogen can include, but not limited to, alfalfa meal, cottonseed meal, ammonium sulfate, calcium nitrate, urea. If you aren't using organic material, then you can use less nitrogen, but you also need to make sure you have a source of phosphorus in there. And you see you're using up to 1/2 to 1 pound per 100 square feet of that's how much nitrogen you want to put out. Here you're using 1.5 to 2 ounces of nitrogen per 100 square feet. You want to make sure, the easiest thing to me is just follow the application rates on the fertilizer label. But there are some fertilizer calculations that you do, and I am not a math teacher. I struggle at teaching. Is anybody good at teaching math? Because I really struggle at it, and I try to teach fertilizer application all the time, but I always seem to mess it up. You can figure out how. Now we're only concerned about how much nitrogen we're putting out in the garden, because nitrogen, if you use too much of it, you can hurt your tender plants, right? And also fertilizers have salts in it, so we really don't want to over-fertilize our plants. If you put too much nitrogen on or too much fertilizer, you can burn them from the salts. If you keep feeding your plants too much nitrogen, nitrogen makes the plants grow green leaves and stems. So if you over-fertilize them, they're going to keep growing leaves and stems, and they may never set fruit for you. Never flower, may never set fruit. So you want to use sparingly the nitrogen. When they're young, you can put more nitrogen on it because they can grow, but then as they start to mature, you may want to back off a little bit on the fertilizer if you don't seem to need it. So this is really small, but you can go online and see it, but we're looking at the middle one here is how many, it's a fertilizer. This is actually more considered for like landscape and lawn, but you can adapt it to your vegetable garden. So instead of 1,000 square feet, you would have 100 square feet. And you take the first number on the fertilizer bag, which is nitrogen, and here you want to apply 1 pound of nitrogen per 100 square feet. Here it's 1,000 square feet, which is what's recommended if you're using organic matter, right? 1/2 to 1 pound. 20 was the fertilizer label, so this is definitely a lawn fertilizer. So it's 1, because that's what we want. We want 1 pound of nitrogen over 0.20, because the 20 recommends 20%, so 20% converted is 0.20, right? So 1 divided 0.20 equals 5. This is how much fertilizer that you would put out per 1,000 square feet, pounds of the actual fertilizer, in order to apply 1 pound of nitrogen. Does that make any sense to anybody?
Yeah.
Okay. So you guys can play around with that. So if you wanted 1/2 pound of nitrogen, so you take 0.5 divided by, if you had a 12-12-12 fertilizer, divided 0.12, that's how many pounds of fertilizer you would need to put out per 1,000 square feet, but then you would have to do more calculations to get it to be 100 square feet.
Jennifer,
Yes.
how often do people calculate like that, or do they just kind of eyeball it and intuitively?
Most people, this is why I say, read the back of the fertilizer label and follow the label. Follow the label, because you can do your own calculations, but math just really, it's hard for me to teach the math, because I understand it in my head, but I can't verbalize it. But just follow the label on the back of the if you get fertilizer for vegetable gardening, it will tell you how much to use. I would, and always look at the application rate, but also the application timing and when you need to reapply too, it's going to tell you. Yes?
So as an organic gardener, I've spent years using all the organic stuff,
It's
right? All my
yeah.
compost. And then the Square Foot Gardener guy, I think, recommends you scoop a can full of bone meal and blood meal. And I always get confused about which is which, but you know, like one is nitrogen and
Right.
one is something else.
It'll say on the package which one's not, it will give you analysis for that too.
Right, but here's what I'm wondering. I heard somewhere a long time ago, and I've been waiting to hear it in this class, that I'm okay as long as I'm sticking with organic, like blood meal or bone meal instead of a made-up fertilizer with a percentage, that I can add, say the blood meal has the nitrogen, I can add that as my extra nitrogen, and I'm not in as much danger of burning my plants using that as I would be, because it takes longer to break down and become available. Is that true?
It is true, and a lot of the organic fertilizers are lower in percentage of nitrogen.
Right.
So, kind of like we saw with the manure.
Like with fish, you know, the fish emulsion,
Yeah.
the stinky stuff we all put on our gardens, that's organic, it's not inorganic. So
Right.
it'll take longer
Right.
to,
Yes,
so we
organic,
don't have to be as sick.
organic fertilizers are slow release fertilizers.
Do we have to be as careful?
I would still be careful. I mean, you still could burn them, you know, but you could probably be a little more lax. But I'd still follow the label and try to
hate
get.
following it.
I
don't
know.
cook that way.
If you choose not to follow the label, then you take all liability on yourself. So I'm not going. I don't want to say don't follow the label, but organic fertilizers are mostly slow release. A lot of them are slow release fertilizers, and they are. I don't know what's. I can't. They're lower in the number. What's the word I'm thinking of? I keep want to say toxic.
Concentrated?
What's that? Not less concentrated. That's good. Yeah, they're less concentrated. So this I found this. You can see this in your slide set, but they also say in chapter 3, there's more fertilizer calculations if you really want to have fun with fertilizer. So with fertilizer, apply as needed. Usually that's every 2 to 3 weeks. And it depends on what you use. If you use a liquid fertilizer, if you use a granular fertilizer, if you use powdered fertilizer, powdered and granular, you kind of like, you broadcast, or you kind of fertilize down the middle on either side of the plants. Again, if you're using an 888, you would use more of that than if you had a 12-12-12. We talked about that. Organic, use less often if you use an organic or slow release. When your plants are young, the main benefit is nitrogen. When your plants are young, because that's what you want them to do, is grow shoots and leaves. As they get older and mature, and as they're ready to start flowering, you might want to back off on the nitrogen a little bit. Fertilizing. She should have gloves on.
Yeah.
Any questions on fertilizers? Yes.
So, if you're intermixing veggies and herbs and the fertilizer situation, is there a worry there, or will the herbs tolerate the vegetable?
Treat your herbs like you're growing vegetables. They require similar fertilization.
Oh, sweet.
Yes.
And then one other quick question is vermicompost compost or fertilizer?
It's worm poop.
Yeah.
Is it worm compost is you saw the horse and chicken, it's even less than that. It's very small, minute nutrients in it. It's not a high concentration of nutrients at all.
Oh, okay.
But it helps condition the soil.
Okay.
So it's compost, but it doesn't have much nutrient value to it.
Okay. So can I mix it in?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It will help hold nutrients, but it doesn't actually have that as much nutrients as you would hope.
Okay. Good.
Other questions on fertilization?
Jenny.
Yes.
Growing up, I see my mom like cleaning fish and then all the entrails and all the blood, buries it, and it's wonderful. So I do that sometimes, but I wonder sometimes whether it's good practice.
That's definitely a practice that has been used in the past. It's basically you're composting immediately by the plant. So I don't see any harm with that, except you could, if you don't bury the fish far enough, you could have animals and things
pick a
digging
big
it up.
stone over it.
Yeah.
But
Don't
this
smash
whole
the
thing,
roots of the plant.
there's something about nitrogen being drawn from
Yeah.
the plant. Does that happen also with fish entrails?
Oh, no.
No? Because, why so?
With your compost, it's the little microbials that are living in the soils that are eating on the nitrogen. So they'd be eating on the fish before the fish turn it. But I mean, there's no really research about how just burying fish around your plants. I just know that's an old antique method of farming that used to be done. So, like I said, there's no research to back that up, but if you feel like it's working for you, then go for it. But we can't really.
What about fish emulsion?
Fish emulsion is listed as an organic, so that's a little different because it's a little more controlled.
Okay.
Because you're buying fish emulsion, it has a label on it, tells you how much to apply.
Right.
Or if you're just burying a fish guts, you really don't know how much you're putting out. So.
When you use inorganic fertilizer, you say it starts immediately, but you still have to wait a couple of weeks, don't you, for it to break down?
Inorganic? No. Well, inorganic, it does depend. We should, inorganic, if you're using we didn't talk about soluble versus insoluble fertilizer, or soluble versus slow release fertilizer.
Well, soluble.
Soluble fertilizers are like the Macronutrients that you mix with water, right?
Oh, well, I'm thinking just of the granular stuff that you throw around.
Well, granular could be soluble or it could be slow release. It depends.
Okay, well.
Usually it's both. Usually it's a good mixture of both. And if you read the back of your fertilizer label, we could do a whole class on fertilizers. Yeah. If you read the back of your fertilizer label, it's going to tell you the percentage that is slow release. So it might say, you might have nitrogen, and it's going to be slow release nitrogen. You can get the other forms in slow release too, but say you have a 12-12-12, and it has a little asterisk, and you go to follow the asterisk, and it says that 4% is from a slow release nitrogen source. So that's 4%, that's not 4% of the 12%, that's 4% of the entire bag, so that's 4 divided by 12, 30%. Slow release nitrogen, which is really, really good actually. To have anything above 30% is good. So that means 70% of that fertilizer is quick release or water soluble. So that would be, as soon as you start watering, that will release faster to the plants. But then the other 30% will release slow over that long period of time, slower. So that's a good point, is that if you get the slow release fertilizers like your Osmocote Dynamite, Miracle Grow Mix 1, you will have soluble fertilizer that will be available to plants right away, but then you also have fertilizer in there that will last for weeks or months later. So, good point. But some people really like to control their fertilizers, so they just want to use the water soluble, that you mix them with your water, turns your water green or blue, that you put out about every 2 weeks, your water, and it's like fertigation. You're fertilizing while you're irrigating your plants. So. Fertigation. You can fertigate, which is a real term. It's a real agricultural term. Yeah.
That's a great word.
Because a lot of growers will have drip tubes, and they'll just put their fertilizer in a big tank mixed with water that will just go through the irrigation tubes.
Wow. The citrus fields
Right.
we're at, that's what they have.
That's what they did, right? So it's kind of a neat process for that too.
Jennifer, I got another question, but I know I've asked quite a few questions.
That's okay, because I'm not going to start this till after break.
I've read about growing comfrey, so that comfrey leaves can be tilled in the soil because they're a great source of nitrogen, but I don't find comfrey here. I went to the store and one little plant is like $5. Do you know if comfrey grows around here?
I don't. Does anybody know if comfrey grows around here? Yes.
It has growth around here, but you can special order it too from Walter Anderson, but it's super invasive. It'll take over your garden like crazy.
It's an invasive plant.
But it's nice, so you till it back and it supplies the nitrogen.
But you could also use other plants that have a lot of nitrogen source in it as a cover crop, like clover. Clover is a great cover crop to use. And I'm thinking the book does talk a little more about some of the cover crops that you can. Alfalfa. There's some other good ones. Beans.
I think buckwheat, I think red clover.
Buckwheat.
I think red clover for the cooler year.
Clover, buckwheat, ryegrass. Ryegrass grows great in the winter, and then it dies when it gets hot out, and that can be tilled in very easily. It's an annual grass. Annual ryegrass, you want to get? It's cheap. It's easy grows. Any other questions? So those are good cover crops in your off season.
Since you're stalling,
Yeah.
it goes back.
There's-
Everybody
start.
says that you've got to plant the trellises on the north side of your garden. So you do that year 1. Then what do you do year 2, year 3, year 4 when you're supposed to be rotating the crops?
Yeah.
You can't always grow those trellises on the north side of your garden and also do a crop rotation.
Well, then you can crop rotate the rest of your garden. I'm not familiar with actually, like if you're growing cucumbers up the, like it depends what you're growing up your trellis, I guess.
Well, cucumbers, beans, peas, anything vining.
Right.
Tomatoes are growing
do
up.
best. Tomatoes and eggplants do best with crop rotation because of some of the diseases that they have. But it's a good point. So it always has to be one that you can move. Or if you don't have any diseases happening, you really don't have to rotate crops. You can put them at the end of the rows and switch your cucumbers with beans. They're different families. So cucumbers and beans could keep being switched on the on there. That's a good point.
But you're always going to.
But you're always going to have either cucumbers or beans on them. You're right. Yes.
One last thing before we close.
Yeah.
There's a Native American system they use that I use in the schools, and it's called the Three Sisters.
Yes.
You plant the corn
Yep.
and beans and squash in the same bed. The squash provide the shade for the plants like a mulch. The beans provide nitrogen for the squash and the corn. And the corn provides the support for the beans. So in that case, that soil's not being depleted of nitrogen because the beans are in there. And it helps put that back into the soil at the same time.
And then you can tilling your beans into the soil is a really good practice too.
Yes.
Your beans and your peas, because then you keep that nitrogen in the soil. All right.